So welcome. My name is Paul Grandal. I'm the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University of Albany. Thank you. This feels amazing to have so many people come to hear a conversation I think everyone is thirsty to have, and the afternoon session did not disappoint. There were a lot of really great sparks and a lot of great energy there. But I want to start first by welcoming and introducing our new University at Albany president, Dr. Avidan Rodriguez, who's here tonight. And I want to start by thanking the many people and organizations who made this event possible, starting with our dedicated staff at the Writers Institute. They're the people with the yellow lanyards doing all the hard work. And we've got a group of really generous, friendly volunteers who are shuttling panelists to and from airports and train stations and doing other things. Let's thank the volunteers. And now our sponsors. I want to acknowledge all of them. Our premier sponsors, the Times Union and the Craig Newmark Philanthropic Fund. Our presenting sponsors, Bean Communications and Renaissance Corporation of Albany in honor of John C. Egan. I'd also like to thank our other sponsors, Albany Public Library Foundation, Center for Law and Justice, Foundation for Information Resources, Science and Technology, Hodgson Russ LLP, M&T Bank, St. Peter's Health Partners, the Law, Youth, and Citizenship Program of the New York State Bar Association, UHY LLP, Pernilla Dake, Paul Grandal, and William Kennedy. Also the Bernard F. Connors Foundation, the Foy Foundation Advised Fund, Catherine Gibson, Margaret and Jonathan Harvey, and the New York Newspapers Foundation. I'm not going to give another preamble like I did this afternoon. A few ground rules. I want to welcome the University at Albany students who are reading Bob Schieffer's book, Overload. 450 students are reading his book right now, and many of them are here. And the last 20 minutes or so of the panel discussion will be open for audience questions. You will need to line up and come to the microphone. If you're in the balcony, if you're a student or anyone in the balcony, you can make your way down and form a line behind the two microphones. You'll get to ask your questions. Like I said, this is being taped and live streamed, so we want to hear your questions. We'll make announcements if they're necessary, but everybody has their program. They can find the times of the panels and the panelists. If you have any questions, you can ask our volunteers with the lanyards, the wonderful University at Albany lanyards. And I just wanted to read one short thing before we introduce our panel. This came from the New York Times. It was a full-page ad campaign they ran as a way to fight back, stand up, to confront fake news, attacks on freedom of the press. I thought it summed up in a few words the foundation of this symposium, what we're trying to get at by having 9 hours of conversation and 6 panels. And this is what the New York Times wrote. The truth is hard. The truth is hidden. The truth must be pursued. The truth is hard to hear. The truth is rarely simple. The truth is necessary. The truth can't be manufactured. The truth isn't red or blue. The truth is hard to accept. The truth pulls no punches. The truth is worth defending. The truth requires taking a stand. The truth is more important than ever. And that's why we're here for telling the truth in a post-truth world. And let me start with our distinguished panelists for this session on presidents and the press, Trump, Nixon, and more. Douglas Brinkley is a professor of history at Rice University, CNN presidential historian, and the author of 24 books, including biographies of Theodore Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. Please welcome Douglas Brinkley. Amy Goodman is the host and producer of the award-winning independent news program Democracy Now! She has co-authored 6 New York Times bestsellers, has won several prestigious awards as an investigative journalist, including the George Polk Award and the Robert F. Kennedy Prize for International Reporting. Please welcome Amy Goodman. Harry Rosenfeld was the Washington Post Metro editor who oversaw the work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein and the Post's Pulitzer Prize-winning Watergate coverage. He is editor-at-large of the Albany Times-Union and author of the book, From Kristallnacht to Watergate, Memoirs of a Newspaperman. Please welcome Harry Rosenfeld. Shayne Goldmacher, chief political correspondent for the New York Times, covering New York City and state politics. He graciously agreed to appear in place of Glenn Thrush, who had to cancel at the last minute because he is working on a major Donald Trump project on deadline. Thrush recommended Goldmacher. His exact words were, "This guy's really, really good." He previously worked as chief White House correspondent for Politico. He covered the Trump administration and the Trump campaign. Please welcome Shayne Goldmacher. And finally, our moderator. I think I'm going to call him the Iron Man of the Symposium, the only one doing 2 panels. He said, "I can do 2 panels, no problem." Bob Schieffer. He's the author of the new book, Overload, Finding the Truth in Today's Deluge of News, which more than 450 of our students at the University at Albany are reading in their classes right now. He's also the former anchor of CBS Evening News, the former host of Face the Nation, a moderator of 3 presidential debates, member of the Broadcasting Hall of Fame, and named a living legend by the Library of Congress. Please welcome Bob Schieffer.
Which is another way of saying the oldest guy on television. That's me. But I'm proud to be here. In fact, I'm proud to be anywhere at this stage of my life. And I'll be very honest, I don't usually run with a crowd this smart, and they're great. So we're going to just dive right in, and I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative. I'm going to start with a guy that's been a hero of mine for a long time, because I was there during Watergate, and Harry was there, and here he is overseeing Woodward and Bernstein, and a story that we'd never seen anything quite like this. And I always get a kick out of when they go through about, you know, where are we going to have the White House briefing and all this stuff, and what difference does it make? I think, if I'm not wrong, Harry, Woodward and Bernstein never set foot in a White House briefing during the entire coverage of Watergate.
That's right.
They found other ways to find the story, and they did a pretty good job of it. So, Harry, tell us this. I mean, people are always asking me if I have ever seen anything like this, what we're seeing right now. And the truth is, I haven't. In fact, I said so many times on television, I've never seen anything like this, that it became a drinking game among the younger people at CBS. Old Bob would come on television and say, I've never seen anything like this. Here we go. Luckily, there were designated drivers, I suppose, because nobody got hurt. But Harry, tell me, have you seen anything like this? And talk about this in comparison to what you saw during Watergate.
Well, you can compare our present situation to Watergate. Yeah. You can compare to this.
Up to your mouth. Right, put it there, like that.
There
Oh,
you
is it?
go.
Thank you very much, Amy. This situation today is comparable to Watergate in some degrees and some specific ways. But you know what? We lived through Watergate, and one of its great accomplishments was that after a long and tedious battle, it finally came to a successful conclusion by a hair, because of the existence of tapes, which the Supreme Court said Congress could see. That was a very narrow escape for us, but the point is we escaped it. Today, we are living in the middle of a developing situation, and we don't know whether we can escape it or how we will escape it. So it is far more dangerous, far more compelling, no matter how much it resembles or doesn't resemble Watergate or any other gate. We have to deal with the here and now of it. And that is a dimension that is frightening to me. Franklin Roosevelt said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. I think we have something to fear, and that is authoritarianism that is lurking behind the actions of our current president, who rejects elements of the Constitution arbitrarily, who abuses his power of office, who finds his coziest relationships with Vladimir Putin and Erdogan and al-Sisi and other people, other strong men. And what scares me, what frightens me, is the possibilities, not the realities of today, but the possibilities, keeping in mind that in Charlottesville, his adherents marched through the streets carrying torches and chanting anti-Jewish slogans, very, very specifically reminiscent of what happened in Nazi Germany. It is not a far-fetched comparison, because many of the traits and many of the behaviors of Trump can also be found in Hitler's rise to power and in Benito Mussolini's rise to power. The fact that they claim they are the leader, the sole leader qualified to lead a troubled nation to the promised land. The fact that within our borders exists a segment of the population that is alienated and has justified grievances and has been not treated well by our political establishment. The fact that Trump chooses to isolate a minority, Mexicans or Muslims, and point to them as the evildoers who are responsible for our state of affairs. The fact, most importantly, that he, in the same words that Adolf Hitler uses, attacks the press as the lying press, because he knows the press is the one institution specifically constitutionally designed to keep an eye on the powerful in government. That's what the First Amendment is about. And Trump very casually says, we can do away with that. We should do away with that. He says, the press wants to print anything that it wants to. Yes, that's right. That's what the First Amendment says. You can print anything you damn well please. Now, if it's libelous, you have to pay for it. But you can print anything you damn well please, or show it on a video, et cetera, et cetera.
So let me ask you, let's go back to Charlottesville, which those pictures were horrible. They were disgusting. But Harry, do you see a connection with what happened in Charlottesville to anything that Donald Trump said? Do you hold him responsible for that?
I hold him responsible for encouraging and engendering these people who may be at his fringes. I hold him responsible for putting into his cabinet, his office, a man who has spoken frankly about extreme nationalism and abets and encourages these people, at the same time playing a double game. I don't approve of them. No, of course I don't approve of them, but they're good people. Among them, making equivalents out of the people who tried to protect the protesters and the ones who occasioned the protests. Yes, I do hold them responsible.
All right, well, let's go to Doug Brinkley. You're the historian here, the official historian. Put all this in some perspective. How does this shape up in comparison to other presidencies?
Well, we do presidential rankings, and you don't ever want to be ranked below William Henry Harrison, who was president for a month, and Donald Trump was already below William Henry Harrison. He has a 32% approval rating right now, because really nothing has gotten done, and it seems to me the story of Trump does have a lot to do with social media, his use of Twitter, and this sort of rise of authoritarianism, right-wing kind of neo-fascism, whatever you want to call it. Trump seems to me to be a combination of things. There's a lot of George Wallace in him. If we recall, when Wallace ran, as you know, Bob, ran for president, he would try to get those white blue-collar workers, not just in Alabama or the South when he ran for president, but he did pretty well in Michigan and some of those upper Midwest states, and say that there's a kind of George Wallace side to Trump. That's just one little part. I think he saw that in 1992, Ross Perot ran a third party, and everybody, it's been a kind of mystical vote, the Perot vote, because Perot got 19% of the vote as a third party candidate. That's a lot, guys, 19%. What was Ross Perot's really fickle candidacy about? Anti-NAFTA, the sucking sound that you hear of your jobs leaving. And I think Trump picked up on some of that Ross Perot energy. Joe McCarthy. Right now you have a Joe McCarthy figure in the White House. In the 1950s, McCarthy was big, but he was on the outside. The establishment Republican was president, Dwight Eisenhower, and Ike didn't like McCarthy. He didn't do enough quickly, but when he did, he did. And as you famously know, the U.S. Army went after Joe McCarthy, and by the end of the 50s, McCarthy's hemorrhaging from drinking wild turkey and dies. But that party, Eisenhower, Joe McCarthy, was going on in the 50s. Well, it's switched now. The McCarthyites have come into power. And so that's something I think to keep in mind. And lastly, they're in the middle of a civil war right now of what is the Republican Party. I think it's going to be interesting to see if these Trump candidates in 2018 that are running not just far right, they're running very far right, whether they get any traction or not, whether Donald Trump really has legs in 18. And I also keep my eye, Bob, on this Oh, and Einstein, when I say McCarthy, Roy Cohen, the famous lawyer, Joe McCarthy was a pal of Trump. There's a connection there. Talking about Nixon, Trump when he was starting in 1980s in New York City as the big builder, he was starting to get a little bit famous, and he got a letter unsolicited from Richard Nixon, Trump, because in the letter said, "My wife, Pat Nixon, saw you on the Phil Donahue show and thought you were going to be president someday. You were so good." And they started dining. Trump and Nixon started having dinners together. This is not an apocryphal letter. President Trump has that letter from Nixon. And if you remember Nixon's silent majority, Nixon's hatred of the press, I mean, we've kind of been deluded in presidential history thinking Reagan took over the Republican Party, and there's that Reagan streak in Trump too. But he went back to Nixon, the dark side of the street, you know, and pitting American against American in the way that Nixon did in the 60s and 70s. So I think he's very Nixonian in the way he operates, and Nixon has the tapes. I've edited 2 volumes of those with my friend Luke Nichter, and these tweets are like the tapes in real time. And you wake up every day scared about what you might be hearing. And so I find this whole year been a very frightening year, but I haven't lost confidence in our democracy. I mean, when you study the Civil War and things, I mean, I'll end by just saying, you know, our own times are not uniquely oppressive.
And one of the things we have to remember in all of this is, for all of that, Donald Trump somehow found and crafted a message that got through to a large number of Americans, especially out through the Rust Belt of the country. People who felt they were forgotten, they were being left behind, they didn't particularly like either candidate in the campaign, didn't really trust Hillary Clinton, didn't really trust him, but thought nothing is working, so I'll just take a flyer on this guy. Shayne, you were there. You were covering all of this for Politico. How did Trump do it?
Well, I want to talk about that message too, because I think one of the most fascinating pieces of the campaign was their conventions, right? This is the distillation of their speeches. Trump gave this big speech, and the key line was, "I alone can fix it." And people sort of remember that one line. And before that, he painted this sort of dystopian description of what America really looks like, and was very dark and negative. And the reviews right afterwards, including in my stories, where this is sort of out of the realm of normal for American politics, right? You don't call things dark, you say things are bright. Peter Hart is, I think, one of the best pollsters in the country. He's a Democratic pollster. He's done the half of the Wall Street Journal polling. And he did a poll of the core message from Trump's speech and Clinton's speech, which was well reviewed at the time, took their names off of it and just read the relevant paragraph. Trump's message won. His message, without him, without the bluster, without who he is as the singular figure, he actually had a core message of things are broken and I can fix it that was more resonant than Stronger Together, which was the sort of final theme that
Well, you know, Hillary Clinton was putting out all these programs and detailed policy papers, but somehow it just never seemed to catch on. People, it didn't seem really to impress people. And was that because of her presentation? Was it because they just simply didn't like her to begin with? And there were a certain number of people who didn't. What do you think, what was wrong with her campaign?
I mean, there's no question that she was a deeply flawed candidate. And after the election, one of her...
But so was he.
But so was he, certainly, right? I mean, you had the 2 most unpopular presidential nominees in American history who happened to be running against each other. You know, during the election, both campaigns said the only person that Donald Trump could beat is Hillary Clinton. And then afterwards, you know, in confidence, the Clinton world, people say the only person Hillary Clinton was going to really be able to beat was Donald Trump. And there they had each other. And so I think that's, you know, there's a perfect storm of things why he was able to beat her in the general election. But don't forget, he beat a very serious field of Republican candidates in the primary, too. So his message worked not just in a primary, but also in that general election.
I remember early on when she was trying to talk her son Jeb out of running, Barbara Bush made the comment, maybe the country's just tired of Clintons, Kennedys, and Bushes, and maybe they just want change. And then she said, and it was a direct quote, If there are only 3 families in America that Americans want to vote for, that's just silly.
I remember going to New Hampshire very early
And
on.
I think there was something to what she said in some ways. I don't think that was the core reason that it came out the way it did. That was well, Amy, I see you sitting there, and I bet you have a different version of what happened here.
I think I might pick up where my brother,
I
journalist
knew
David
you
Goodman,
would.
left off. It's just in the blood. But I think that the red carpet was rolled out for Donald Trump by the corporate media. And I wanted to cite a poll because, Bob, this afternoon, you pointed out, you said Hillary Clinton, in talking to Mika Brzezinski, she said, I mean, here was Donald Trump always willing to go on the media, and here was Hillary Clinton, she wasn't. And that was true, randomly talk to anyone. But there was someone else, and that was Bernie Sanders. And we have to go back and look at how he was treated, because a number of polls show if the race was Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, it might have come out differently, appealing to the very same, not only the kinds of people Donald Trump was, but to a much more expanded, diverse population in the United States. So I want to go back to 2015. The Tyndall Report analyzed major network campaign coverage in 2015. In over 1,000 minutes of national broadcast TV airtime devoted to all the campaigns, Donald Trump got 327 minutes, or close to 1/3 of all the campaign coverage. Bernie Sanders received just 20 minutes. Hillary Clinton got 121 minutes of the coverage, 6 times that of Sanders. ABC World News Tonight aired 81 minutes of reports on Donald Trump, 20 seconds for Bernie Sanders. I want to know what that 20-second report was. What did he do that was so newsworthy? But this is
It must have been a great quote.
extremely significant, because when you hear someone speaking for themselves, it has enormous power. Bernie Sanders dealt with a number of issues, whether you liked him or hated him, but his voice was iced out. I remember, I think it was called Super Tuesday 3, something like that, March 15th. And it was 5 major primaries that night. I think Cruz was still in it, Rubio was in it, he might have pulled out that night. It was Illinois, very close, because it was Hillary's home state, and she was neck and neck with Sanders. It was all the candidates. And that night, as we were watching and covering this, you heard every candidate's concession or victory speech, as you should, all the networks covering it. There was not a mention of Bernie Sanders. They didn't even say, where'd he go? Did he fall asleep? In fact, he was at the largest rally of any of these candidates that night. It was in Phoenix, Arizona. 8,000 to 10,000 people were there. Not a mention or a clip of his voice speaking. The next day, we weren't planning to do this, but we decided to run a clip of Bernie Sanders' speech the night before. Who would have thought it was a revolutionary act to play a clip of a speech on one of the primary nights of one of the major candidates? And we have to go back there to understand how we came to this point. The other candidates trudged from state to state. Donald Trump didn't have to. He had all of the corporate media with their microphones waiting. He certainly had more time, just the open mic, waiting for Donald Trump to come to the podium than they ever played of Bernie Sanders at the podium. And yet, if you look at the number of people who came out for their rallies, certainly Bernie Sanders vied with or surpassed Donald Trump in a number of those rallies. That was simply ideological, an ideological exclusion. As Noam Chomsky says, the media manufactures consent, whether it's for war or for candidates, and that all has to be challenged if we don't want to see something like we saw happen again.
Well, I think you make some very good points. I don't completely agree with your conclusions. I do not believe that the media, we're blamed for three different things. We're said, number one, we gave him too much time on television and to the exclusion of others. Then that was one line of attack. Then we were told, no, you didn't take him seriously. And you should have taken him seriously like his supporters were taking him seriously. And then a third line of attack was, no, he went all around you on social media and completely blocked you out. So, I mean, you kind of have to pick your own adventure here. We can't be guilty of all three of these things, which are all diametrically opposed. When I did this book, I interviewed people from both Fox News and from CNN who said that they thought that they had, in retrospect, had given Donald Trump too much time on television. I'm not sure I agree with that. He was drawing these enormous crowds, and that was
So was
news.
Bernie Sanders. And
Well, we now know that he was, but in those days, I understand what you're saying. Let me just explain what I'm saying here. This was somebody who was not even a member of the Democratic Party.
But he was the major Democratic candidate.
Who was challenging the Democrat. And I think we didn't catch on to that fast enough. I don't disagree with you. That you were out there, Shayne. What was your take of what was going on out there?
And so I was focused mostly on the Republican primary, so I followed all the Republican candidates across the country. So I didn't cover either Clinton or Bernie in the primary. I covered the Republican primary. But I can say from other people's reporting, including my colleagues at the time, that I think Bernie Sanders, at least early in the campaign, was among the people who did not take his candidacy particularly seriously. At least for the first several months, he wasn't campaigning full-time until he realized the power of his crowd. So often the media are lagging indicators of what's happening, and I think certainly in that case too. On that particular March primary night, I remember very well, Donald Trump did something no one else had ever done. He didn't hold a victory rally or a speech. He held a press conference, and he took crazy questions for like 60 minutes and dominated the evening news. And it was just one of those nights where you're like, he really is capturing people and doing something in a totally different way on the day that Marco Rubio dropped out.
And I would also say, not necessarily in our defense, but as a matter of fact, Bernie Sanders was on the Sunday shows a lot. We all put him on. All three networks did. So his message was getting out there.
Well, let me say something. I think it was the amount of time that was unopposed, just giving the airwaves over to his speeches. And that is nothing that you saw. You saw nothing like that with Bernie Sanders, just watching speeches of his wherever he was. That's what they did. I mean, what you were talking about that night of that speech that Donald Trump gave, he was hawking Trump water, Trump steaks. They never pulled away. And he certainly used this to his advantage. They didn't even play. I mean, he was just having, as you said, that press conference in his hotel at Mar-a-Lago. And Sanders was speaking to 8,000 people. Why not also play his hour address?
Well, you know who agreed with you is the campaign managers of all the Republicans. They couldn't believe how much time that Donald Trump was getting. And there was this amazing post-election conference at Harvard. Some of the news came out there about the fighting between Corey Lewandowski and the Clinton operatives. But the night before, the head of CNN did a panel kind of like this, and he talked about what he did, and all the Republican operatives were in there, and they began to heckle him. The campaign managers of all the Republican candidates were heckling the head of CNN for the free time and the open podium that they gave him. I was sitting at the table with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, now the White House press secretary, who worked for her father as his top campaign official, and she too was complaining that she couldn't get on television as the campaign manager, or her father couldn't get on television as a candidate. But when she went to work for Trump and his advisor, she was on TV all the time. I mean, so there was a structural problem that Democrats were frustrated with, the Republicans were frustrated with. He was dominant on television.
Well, let me ask you this, Shayne, you were there. What was it like to cover Donald Trump is in comparison to other candidates that you've covered in the past?
Well, I was with Politico for the cycle, so don't forget we were blackballed, blacklisted for a portion of it, so we couldn't actually go to his events unless you went in. Some of my colleagues were escorted out by his security staff. But there was an energy there. I mean, there's no question. I mean, one of the stories that I regret not writing, I was with him about a week and a half before the end of the election. He was in Florida. They had started in Miami, we went to Orlando, and then we went to Pensacola. And you start in Miami, the biggest metropolitan population of the three cities. I expected a big crowd. It was like a meh crowd for Trump, right? Like, not that much energy. He attacked Katie Tur at this particular rally. If you've seen any clips of it, that's what this rally was. Go to Orlando, big crowd. You know, Trump-like rally, 10,000 people. We get to Pensacola late that night. I cannot see the end of the crowd. There's, I don't know, their estimates are like rough because they weren't giving accurate estimates necessarily. 25,000 people in Pensacola. That's unlike any campaign I've ever seen. Usually the farther you go from population centers, the smaller the crowds are, right? He was drawing people in small parts of America in massive numbers in a way that no one else does. I was with him in like rural North Carolina, 4,000 people in a town of 400 people. Upper New Hampshire, 1,000 people in a town of 100 people. How do you write about that? How do you capture that? That's a huge challenge. I think it was a challenge for Bernie Sanders too. People showing up at rallies isn't voters necessarily, but it certainly ended up being in his case.
But when somebody is drawing crowds like that, that becomes news. And you're going to cover that. And it does tend to feed on itself. But, you know, I'm not the one that got the crowds out there for him. He's the one that got them out there. I show up with a camera to take pictures of it. What do you make of that, Doug?
I think Amy's, just to amplify her point, you know, I last week was at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. I'm not a huge Andy Warhol fanatic. He's so important culturally, but the museum's great. Go to Pittsburgh, see the Andy Warhol Museum. But it dawns on you just how much celebrity means in our country. You know, in the early days, it was generals. There'd be General Washington on snuff. You had to be like a military general, you know, and now we don't do generals. We do celebrities. I think Ronald, you know, when I've written on Jack Kennedy, and Bob, your great friend, Walter Cronkite, who adored you so much, Cronkite had in 1952 gave a class on how to look on TV, and Jack Kennedy took the class and Nixon didn't. Sam Rayburn took it too, incidentally. But and then by 57 to 60, Joe Kennedy Sr. got a private aviation for Jack Kennedy. So Lyndon Johnson's thinking, I'm going to be so dogged on legislation. I know every issue, which he did, on civil rights and insurance and health care. And the people are going to see my policy and how thoughtful I am, kind of like Hillary Clinton. And there Jack Kennedy took his private plane and was bombing here and there and became a kind of celebrity president. In the Warhol Museum, it's filled with, you know, blue Jackies and, you know, 15 paintings of Jackie and Mick Jagger. And, well, Trump, like Ronald Reagan, has been a celebrity for a long time. And I may have been fatigue of Clinton as celebrities. They have been, but there was a fatigue, and I think there's a fatigue in the Bushes, where Donald Trump's been around enough as a celebrity, and so people wanted to see him. If Trump enters the room, and you know, it just fills up. It creates a type of weird celebrity energy. And I wonder the dangers of this for our society now, where we're creating how many Twitter followers do you have as a judgment? How many of your success? And we're creating a kind of hype. It's not the 15 minutes of fame of Warhol. It's just a celebrity-obsessed America that we've lost the difference between celebrity and good governance. And I worry about that.
You know, I think that's a great point. And I said during the previous panel, I thought that Donald Trump really understood television. I was not sure he understood much about politics. But the technique that he employed, whether he knew this is what he was doing or not, I think he didn't know the name of it, but it's what you call in politics the dead cat theory. And it goes like this. If you're having a dinner party, and no matter what the conversation is about, If somebody walks up and throws a dead cat in the middle of the table, you're going to talk about the dead cat. And that's what Donald Trump was able to do time after time, day after day. He'd start early in the morning, and whatever the campaign was about that day, whatever the conversation or the narration was, he'd throw a dead cat in the middle of the table, and for the rest of the day, everybody in politics was responding to what he had said. And he was just very, very good at that. Amy, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm very concerned tonight about the possibility of the U.S. getting embroiled in a war.
Good.
When you think about where Donald Trump has taken this country, and he doesn't do it alone. You talked about Donald Trump calling the press the enemy of the American people. He's really attacked the press. I mean, so much so that the mainstream networks, the corporate networks, start to sound like Democracy Now! You know, the media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society, we say all the time. And it's because he's hitting them personally so hard, both individuals, as well as talking about the failing New York Times and fake news CNN, that they have found their media backbone and the critical importance, you know, really expressing the importance of media in a democratic society. I hesitate to say this publicly, but I think if he were just to stop, I've always been confounded by why he is doing this. Because if he stopped for even just 1 week, the establishment media tends to wrap itself around the establishment, protect it. But they have to defensively protect themselves, as I absolutely agree they should. But there are two ways they do still fall into line. And one of those ways is when it comes to war. They circle the wagons around the White House. I mean, we saw it with the Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction. David mentioned earlier this report around Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UN, February 5th, 2003. FAIR did the study of the 4 major nightly networks, CBS Evening News, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, and PBS NewsHour. Of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell's address when he was Secretary of State, which he would call a blot on his career when he alleged, yes, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. In that 2-week period, 393 interviews done around war on those 4 nightly newscasts, 3 of almost 400 of them. When the country was half for war and half against, only 3 of almost 400 were with anti-war leaders. That is a way that the media paves the way for war. What about now? Let's look at
Let me just interrupt you 1 minute.
Yes.
Are you saying that we should give equal voice to anti-war leaders when the Secretary of State says he has concluded that they have weapons of mass destruction?
Absolutely. That's exactly the time.
But-
I would just argue this, Bob. I would say we don't have state media in the United States.
Well, I hope not.
But if we did, how would it be any different in these cases? When you have, and you know, I think the first person to say that they wish the media had challenged them far more was Colin Powell himself, so horrified by what he had come to conclude that ended up not being substantiated. But let me take it to right now. So Trump's in office for a couple of weeks, and he attacks those 59 cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles on the Syrian airbase. I'm not going to talk about Fox for a minute. I'm going to talk about the networks that are considered anti-Trump. I'm going to talk about perhaps the most anti-Trump network, MSNBC. I came home that night, I turn on MSNBC, and there is Brian Williams saying, "We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these 2 U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, 'I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.' And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield." That is not Fox. It's not Breitbart.
Well,
That
let
was
me also
Brian
say
Williams.
it's not CBS News.
Yes.
Would you grant me that?
Yes, it is not.
And
it
to
is
say that we were somehow encouraging him
No,
to
no,
go
but
to
I'm
war
I'm
with Japan.
I'm
I mean, with North Korea. That's simply not true.
No,
Amy.
I am talking about MSNBC talking about the night he dropped the bombs on the airfields. Then you have the dropping of the Moab, you know, what the Pentagon calls the mother of all bombs, the largest non-nuclear bomb ever used in the world. Trump's a few months in office, and inexplicably, he drops it in Afghanistan. And the major networks, the pundits, the journalists are saying, Donald Trump became president tonight. The day after the bombing of the airfield, Fareed Zakaria on CNN said, Donald Trump became president. There is a kind of, in a time of war, at that point, the media wraps themselves around those in power. That's when it's most difficult, but when the media has to be independent, it is a matter of life and death. And that's why I'm concerned about North Korea.
You weren't old enough to be there during Vietnam. I was. I was. The media didn't wrap itself around the government. It quickly came apart. We had a convention in 1968, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where it looked like the whole country was coming apart. And I think that the media figured out this war was wrong a long time before the administration did. I went to Vietnam. I was there. I was there 6 weeks, and I was a hawk when I went. I was a young reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. In 6 weeks, I figured out this wasn't going to work, no matter what the best intentions were. It just simply wasn't going to work. What I could not figure out is why those in government did not figure it out. But I have to say, Amy, I don't believe that was the fault of the media. The media didn't lead us into Vietnam. And hearing you, obviously, when things like dropping the mother of all bombs happens, this is still a free press. You're going to have people that are going to, some are going to think it's a good idea and some are not. But to somehow suggest that we're some giant monolith, I simply don't agree with that. And I take your point, and I respect you for saying it. I just don't agree with it. Doug?
Well, you're talking about Vietnam, and Morley Safer, you know, back in 1965, famously, when he was in Vietnam, they got footage of CBS of burning of huts of Vietnamese, and our guys, the bad guys, atrocities by the United States size, and CBS got that footage, and they had to decide in New York whether to run it in '65, because at that point we were still World War II Korea and the space program. I mean, the press was the government. They really, you know, we're all in it together. And when Morley Safer got that footage done, they decided to run it on the nightly news, and it showed up for the first time, really, American soldiers as the bad guys. And that night, Dr. Frank, was it Leonard with CBS?
Frank Stanton?
Frank Stanton, I think it was. I think Frank Stanton got the call. It was from LBJ. And it was like rang in the middle of the night, picks up, hello? It's like, you know, Frank, do you know who this is? I go, no, sir. He goes, this is the President of the United States. And he goes, oh, Mr. President, what's up? And he said, did you know what happened today? Your communist correspondent, Morley Safer, ran a piece shitting on the American flag. And Stanton said, oh, no, Morley, we checked him out. He's Canadian. He's not communist. And Johnson says, I knew there was something wrong with that boy. And the point is, that same year, Bob Dylan did the Ballad of the Thin Man, when Dylan's doing, you know, something is happening and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? And Mr. Jones was Lyndon Johnson. It was a whole generational schism. So I think in the Vietnam period, CBS did its job. It became known as the color broadcasting system by the right-wingers and segregationists, because they were covering civil rights so thoroughly. But things changed with the diversification of media And I don't know where things are at now. I mean, it's not just CBS where everybody's tuning in to Cronkite and you know,
Well,
or you know.
And you know, Doug, to
I
just
think
add
it's,
one quick thing to that, it was when Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, George Christian, came to him and said, Walter Cronkite is in Vietnam, and he's said we need to get out of Vietnam. And I talked to George about this, and he said, the president looked at him and said, if I've lost Walter, I've lost the American people. And that was the beginning of us deciding to get out, because at that time Westmoreland was asking for even more troops. Yeah. And Johnson at that point said no. Let me get to Harry. Harry, tell me about, you look like you want to say something.
I'm listening to all this,
the mic.
wondering what has it really got to do with our situation looking forward. But I want to back up to Amy's a little bit. She's very scholarly, she's very knowledgeable, and she picks up a true fact here and then expands it to include the media. An event done by one person then becomes the media. Well, I know a lot of other people are doing the same thing. Now, the media is not perfect, never was, never will be. But the media in the long run, or the newspapers, did reveal the Vietnam War foibles, did catch up on Iraq, that they didn't catch on from day one, that they took the word of the Secretary of State. They shouldn't. You believe you should never take the word of the Secretary of State.
Sort of
That's-
following in the tradition
that-
of
that-
I.F. Stone, who says all governments lie.
No, I think we're imperfect, and we're more gullible than, we're more mainstream, if you will, than we probably should be. No question about that. But let's talk about where we are today going forward. And the fact that Bernie Sanders didn't get enough coverage, which he may or may not have gotten. For one thing, he was saying the same thing from the left that Trump was saying from the right. And is not the issue. The issue is this ridiculous person is in the seat of the presidency. He owns the nuclear codes, and we can be fried any minute if in his egotism he decides he's really pissed off. And that's what's facing us, and what do we do about it when the Congress, which seems to be one of the only remedies to him, or a cabinet that would unlikely take up arms against him, they could do it. We're saddled with this man who is he's a ticking time bomb. And our focus should be on what can the public do to contain him. And that should be the focus of our discussion.
Okay, I think what we're going to do. That's a very good point. I'm going to ask a couple of more questions, and I have written questions from students, and I felt like we didn't get to them soon enough. I'm going to ask you students who wrote questions, come down here to these microphones, and we'll recognize you and let you be seen and ask your questions. And so, Shayne, at the New York Times, what are you doing different now than the Times used to do? I know for one thing, you have reporters that going on duty now at 6 a.m. on tweet patrol. Elizabeth, they are. I mean, you know, I was at work for a morning newspaper, and the way it normally works at a morning paper, you wander in about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning, you have your coffee, and the beat reporters go off to cover their beats, and everybody comes back about 5:30.
Can we get that system back, please?
Yeah. And the Times, Elizabeth Buemiller, who I describe in the book as feisty, and she really is. I've known her for a long time, and she's a great reporter. And she's really doing a good job with the Washington Bureau. But she has totally overhauled that bureau now. And like the Washington Post, which has reinvented itself, the Times, everybody goes, I mean, they have, what do you have now, 6 White House reporters?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm less familiar with the Times White House structure because I covered the White House at Politico, and now I'm at the Times. But they do have I think even 7 people.
Yeah.
There is a staff that get in at 6 in the morning, as there was at Politico during the campaign. I can tell you during the Trump campaign, Trump staffers got in at 6 in the morning to watch. He had a certain pattern of what shows he watched at what hours. They got in at 6 a.m. to watch Fox and Friends.
So I guess the question, how do you all handle tweets? Do you handle them like an electronic press release, or you obviously take them seriously, and I think we have to.
You know, I very much disagree with people who say, and there's a whole group of people who say you cannot cover Donald Trump's tweets. I think his tweets are incredibly newsworthy because they're, as Douglas said, they're like an unfiltered view into what he's thinking. They're, you know, my old colleague at Politico, Michael Cruz, described it as like, I found Donald Trump's secret diary. It's a real-time diary of what he's thinking about the world, and it's absolutely news. I think the challenge with Trump, and this applies to his tweets and applies to everything, is he has a looser relationship with what is true and what is not true. Perhaps a euphemism. I want to read you something from his book.
Okay.
So you understand his thinking about the media is unchanged for 40 years, and Roy Cohn was a huge part of that. He wasn't just a passing friend. He was a critical part of Donald Trump's upbringing. And in his Art of the Deal, which I encourage everybody to read, if you don't want to buy the copy, find a way to read it. It is an unfiltered view. He may not have written every word of the book, but it is his words. And he said this, he said, the final key to the way I promote is bravado. I play to people's fantasies. People may not always think big themselves, but they can still get very excited by those who do. That's why a little hyperbole never hurts. People want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of promotion. That defined his approach to the media in the campaign. It defines his approach to tweeting in the morning, and it defines his approach to governance. Go beyond what's necessarily there, and if people pull it back, you end up where you're comfortable. And meanwhile, you got attention the entire time.
All right, well, let's go to questions from out here. And you kids, you students, have you come down? If you have, step right up. Come on down. This is just like The Price is Right here. No, it's not. Go ahead.
I'd like to expand the conversation a little bit. We've been talking about media in the structure of the nation state. And I think the era of the nation state is waning. And the era of the global corporate state is evolving, where corporations have more money, more political influence, and more farther reach globally in each country. How is the media going to respond to this, and how has it affected this transitional period? How has it affected the independence of the media in this country?
All right, let's hear from the panel. Who'd like to take that? I know who wants to take it, but no.
I was just
Amy, we want to get your take on this.
Do you have?
Go ahead, Doug.
I just was going to say, you know, when you were talking, it made me think of Eisenhower's farewell address and his warning of an industrial military complex and just how intertwined all of that's become. Ironically, Eisenhower now is being very liked by moderates on the left and even people on the left because of his farewell address pulling out of the Korean War and that fame and the warning of just what happens if corporate money and politics takes over. And certainly I think it's a huge danger we're always having to be on alert for, and it may be too late at this point. The corporatism, that maybe, you know, that was the idea of globalism, the Clinton doctrine. Bill Clinton was American trade desk everywhere, the Tom Friedman, any country that has a McDonald's won't attack another McDonald's. And, but this is an idea of American economic globalism, which I don't know what's going on right now. I mean, I still feel that's the most powerful force out there, but Trump, the fear factor you so eloquently mentioned, that who knows what's going on with North Korea here, makes it hard to think on sometimes those large points of people like Noam Chomsky that, you know, because we're in crisis mode, you know, every day.
And I think some of this has to do with this technology revolution that we're going through now. I mean, you know, you've had the emergence of Facebook, for example, they have a circulation of 1.5 billion people now, but only until maybe in the last couple of weeks have they acknowledged they're actually a media company. They've said, we're a technology company. We really can't take responsibility for what appears here. This is a very complicated issue because it infringes on a free press, on the right to parody, and all of these things. I mean, how do you protect this space for legitimate political dialogue, which is what I think we're having here tonight, and something that's just made up out of whole cloth that amounts to crying fire in the theater? Facebook says they're working on it now. Google says they're working on it, but I think this is something we really don't know how this is going to sort itself out. It's like the invention of the printing press and the influence it had on the people of Europe in those days. It was a great thing on the one hand, but on the other hand, there were 30 years of religious wars before things sort of equilibrium had been reached. The great news about social media and all of this today is that the news can get around. You can do things we couldn't do before. The bad news, one of the parts of the bad news is now the nuts can all find each other. And we've got to figure out how to deal with that. So we really don't know how it's going to shake down. Another one?
Yes, hi. It's a pleasure to be in your presence.
Thank you.
So my question is, I think I saw you speak about it. I'm not sure on what program. I think it was on Charlie Rose, about the depletion of newspapers, and most notably the depletion of news journalists or newspapers outside of New York, D.C., or L.A.
Yeah.
So my question is, does that make middle Americans, most notably the silent majority, the people who voted for Donald Trump, does that make those people more susceptible to fake news since they don't have like newspapers in their towns, and that news isn't coming out of St. Louis, or news isn't coming outside of, you know what I mean?
I get and I want somebody else on the panel to talk about that, but let me just tell you a couple of statistics of where we are. One of the bad things is the coming of the web has thrown our local newspapers into crisis. They simply can't find a business model to hire enough people to do what they used to do. I mean, they can't do investigative reporting now. We've lost 126 newspapers across the country in the last 12 years, and the statistic you're referring to is to me, the most surprising thing I found when I was doing the book. In 2004, 1 reporter in 8 lived in Los Angeles, New York, or Washington. That number is now down to 1 in 5. In 21 of the 50 states, there is not a single newspaper that has the money or the desire to send a correspondent to Washington to cover their local state delegations. In my home state of Texas, there are now newspapers that can't afford to send a correspondent to Austin to cover the state government. So this has changed everything. It has increased social media. It has brought new importance to that. We're seeing some great things like the Texas Tribune down in Texas now. They cover the state legislature and give away their stories to any newspaper that wants to run them, because there are towns that don't even have news coming about their own state government. This, in journalism, and everybody in journalism recognizes this is the real problem, and that is with the local newspapers. Because, you know, if we don't find some entity to do what we expect of local newspapers, and that is to keep an eye on the local government, then we'll have corruption at levels we've never seen before. So somebody else talk about this now.
Well, when I was a much younger man, thank you, Amy, again, always. People objected to newspapers because they weren't objective enough. You would get criticisms that said, you were not objective enough. And then some years ago, some decades ago, it began to change. And we have degenerated into a group of tribes. And we're no longer interested in objective. We're interested in hearing the point of view of our particular inclination. And we're looking for reinforcement of that. And the intensifier of that and maybe the progenitor of it was the internet, which made all this possible, which meant that people could find themselves who were isolated in this part of the country, in that part of the country, and down here, and didn't know about each other, all of a sudden can coalesce, and all of a sudden they become a force, or a greater force than they could ever be isolated by themselves. And that is the great danger to our society. We have MSNBC and we have Fox. We watch one or the other for the point of view. They don't put a lot of reporters in the field, but they sure have a lot of opinions about what reporters do. And what they now thrive on is something called breaking news. Now, breaking news, to my definition, is something that happens now, and now you report it. It isn't something that you report at 9 a.m. and describe it at 6 p.m. as breaking news. That's broken news. And this comes to the point of this whole weekend. We have to, Senator Moynihan so famously said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, Amy. You're not entitled to your own facts." And we and the media need to be the deliverer of facts. And if we don't get it right the first day, Amy, or the second day, we publish the third day, and maybe we get a bit of it right.
Amy.
Let me talk about another issue where the media across the board falls short on the facts, and that is the issue of climate change. Now, this is science, right? Right now, from the hurricanes, Irma, Maria, Harvey, to the massive fires that are consuming Northern California, the media has done a very good job, 24 hours a day. They haven't quite done the same thing with Puerto Rico, but basically 24 hours a day, bringing you the stories of the inundation of Houston and beyond, and then what's happening now with the fires in Napa and Sonoma. Another two words, besides breaking news, are extreme weather and severe weather flashing on your TV screen. Almost never do they talk about the issue of climate change. What about flashing those two words, global warming and climate change? On this issue, if you look at the 24 hours a day, because I see someone saying that isn't true, there will be, in the print press, I think it isn't true. I think there is more discussion of it. But on the cable networks, where you're turning to them, where you're trying to get a sense of what's happening, the fact that they do not make a connection to a scientific phenomenon that has been universally established. We all know that the president is a climate change denier, and that what we see really in Washington, what he surrounded himself by, is the oiligarchy, right? You have Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, former head of the largest oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil. You've got the Energy Secretary, Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, who was on the board of the Energy Transfer Partners that owns Dakota Access Pipeline. You've got Scott Pruitt, sued the EPA 14 times, now is head of the EPA, rolling back environmental protections. Okay, we know that is how the government feels. But the media is supposed to be the counter to that. It's supposed to be educating us about, I mean, look at Las Vegas. They're trying to find the motive for the shooter. When it comes to these disparate weather events, from these massive hurricanes to fires, you don't automatically make the connection unless you understand the science of climate change. The meteorologists should have their licenses revoked if they don't start making those connections.
Next question.
This question is mostly directed at Amy because I watch her show Democracy Now! You've given a little bit of coverage to an organization I'm following called Brand New Congress, which has recently teamed up with another organization called Justice Democrats. Both want to run a large number of progressive independents in Democratic and to a lesser extent Republican primaries in 2018. These could be viewed as a continuation of the Sanders movement. And I want to pose a very broad question, which is that, do you think the left needs to attempt to take over and reform the Democratic Party or start a viable third party?
Well, as a journalist, I think it's important to provide a forum to have those discussions and to not talk about, but give voice to these organizations that are really today looking at where we stand, how we got to this point, and what's going to happen. What is going to challenge the kind of concentration of power that we see right now in Washington. And we need that discussion and to hear all of these voices. There's nothing more powerful than people speaking for themselves.
You know, I would just add to that, I think that both parties are coming apart right now. I think they're at their lowest point. And the fact that candidates can now, and organizations can now raise money, has just made both parties less indispensable than they once were when they kind of controlled all that. But I think one of the most interesting things that's happening today is what's happening on the right side among the Republican Party, because you're now seeing the Mercer family, that's Steve Bannon, rising up to challenge the Koch brothers on that side of the aisle. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that sorts itself out.
Roy Moore beat Luther Strange.
Do what?
Roy Moore beat Luther Strange in the
Yeah.
Alabama primary.
Yes, he did. But I mean, you can't judge the effectiveness by one election, but that's a very interesting development that's taking place. And I think you're seeing much the same thing taking place on the left side now. I think right now, the number of people who call themselves either Democrats or Republicans is at the lowest point it's ever been in the history of both parties. So I think this whole thing is kind of revolving around right now. I wouldn't make any prediction on what I think who the candidates are going to be in 2020 or even in this midterm election. So we'll see what happens here.
Harry said that we are in a very dangerous situation right now, and I believe we are, and that we need to be more forward-looking than necessarily looking over the failures or issues of the past. And one of the things I think that we need to do is, and this is what seems to be going on this weekend, is an examination to a certain extent among the panelists, a self-examination of what's happening now. And I want to tie this to what Amy said about the fact that the cable news networks, which are not running 24/7 news, but a lot of punditry and high drama in terms of fights between various commentators who are not addressing the issue of climate change. To what extent, I'm drawing in your comment too about the love affair with celebrity that the U.S. has had. To what extent has this love affair with celebrity, the need for high ratings, infected and affected the way in which especially television news is being handled?
Well,
Maybe this has to be a rhetorical
I would
question.
start by saying I think we do need to focus more attention on climate change, and we've done a lot on it, but I think we need to do a lot more. We didn't create these celebrities. You know, I mean, we've done a lot of things that I think you could find fault with, but I don't think that was our fault. And who else wants to talk about that?
I wouldn't mind leaping in on a couple points here. One, loved what you said about climate change, and there was a moment, history does teach us moments, back to Bob's making me think about CBS a lot, but after 1969, when Neil Armstrong went on the moon, news said, what's the next big story? And at the beginning of 1970, it actually was New Year's Day at CBS, they said, we're going to make 1970 the year of the environment. And CBS started covering over and over, because color television went color in 1967.
Earth
the nightly
Day.
news. They covered Earth Day, that whole March of 70. Cronkite had Barry Commoner as his echo buddy, and John Lindsay, mayor of New York City, covering, and they made Earth Day a giant deal, and they led the charge. And by the end of that year, Richard Nixon created the EPA, not because he wanted to. The original EPA document by William Ruckelshaus, the first head of the EPA, Nixon puts next to the key points, bullshit. He was terrified that Ed Muskie was getting all about the environment, and he was going to have to run against Muskie in '72. The points being, I do think we need to step it up on the climate change issue on the national media and find ways to get people excited to cover it.
But,
Over here.
I just wanted to finish. What
Oh,
about
okay.
the issue of, for example, how many people watch MSNBC not so much to learn about news, but to see Rachel Maddow, or Fox to see Sean Hannity, and before
Well,
him?
I don't know if it's because they want to see her, they want to see Sean. They're looking for validation. These are what I call validation channels. People don't necessarily watch them because they want to get the news. They want to validate what they already believe. And I think one of the reasons we have this great divide right now in the country, and we go back to our own sets of facts, if you listen to one specific source, you're going to get one set of facts. And if you listen to another one, you're going to get another set of facts. So we're no longer basing our opinions on the same data, on the same facts. And I think that's one of the downsides of this, this proliferation of news that we now get 24/7, and it's so difficult to separate what's true, what's not true, and what's somewhere in between. But that, the coming of the validation channels happened a long time before we got to digital. That started up, back when cable was just coming of age. Here you are.
Yes. When I look at independent media, and I follow Amy Goodman for years. When I look at independent media and I look at
was wondering who that person was following me.
Antoine. When I look at independent media and corporate media, I'm a chess player. I look at independent media, they're more of an offensive, defensive strategy that they use. They come out front of the issues. Corporate media is more of a, I didn't know, after the fact, after things occur, with weapons of mass destruction and climate change. I'm sure when something happened with the geostorm, then the corporate media said, well, if we would have only known that this was going to happen. It seemed like independent media, perhaps the corporate media needs to take cues from Amy Goodman. Let her, teach her, I think,
Okay.
As far as reporting, in my opinion, I believe that's the strategy that should be used. Offense, defense, rather than a defensive, offensive strategy of, not knowing and making excuses after the fact.
Well, we're not making excuses. Our job is to report on what's going on, and we try to give people an objective opinion of what that is, or an objective report. Is that what that is? We don't see ourselves as the opposition party here. Okay. And that's what this administration is trying to paint us as, but that's not how we see our responsibility. But I appreciate your point, and I'm happy to hear you state it. Does anybody else want to say anything here?
I think the underlying issue of what you're saying is there is so much going on that doesn't hit the corporate media radar screen. Yes. And the biggest, really, it's the development of movements and giving those voice to movements at a point as they're developing. And I'll use the example in the election year of the standoff at Standing Rock. That is such a perfect example. It was historic. Beginning April 1st, 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota, they open up their property to what they call the resistance, to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline that they called the Black Snake, that would snake its way from North Dakota, the Bakken oil fields, taking the fracked oil from North Dakota, South Dakota, through Iowa and Illinois, and then hooking up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. The Native Americans said no. They didn't call themselves protesters. They called themselves water protectors. They didn't want this pipeline going under the Missouri, the longest river in North America, concerned that it would destroy destroy the clean water for 17 million people downstream. And they started to gather. First it was scores of people, then hundreds, then thousands of people. It became the largest unification of Native American tribes that this country had seen in decades, from Latin America, the United States, the First Nations of Canada. It grew through the election year. The networks are hardly covering it. Thousands of Native people and non-Native people are going to Standing Rock. More and more resistance camps open. We go Labor Day weekend. And this goes to the issue of whether people have to get revved up over climate change, or if they really are, and the networks aren't just giving their microphones, going to where not the silence is, but actually where so much is happening. We covered the protests. They were astounding, fully met by militarized police. This is recycling in America today. Take the weapons from Afghanistan, Iraq, give them to the police departments of this country, and they face off against nonviolent civil disobedience, water protectors. And then we cover the standoff just that weekend of Labor Day, when the Dakota Access Pipeline guards, facing off against nonviolent water protectors, unleash dogs on the protesters. Dogs. And they are biting them. We are filming. The people are bitten, maced, beaten, but they prevail. And the guards eventually move back. I mean, it wasn't lost on the first African-American president of this country, President Obama, when he saw the video of the dogs. We put that online that night. We showed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. Within 48 hours, there were 14 million views. Any corporate network executive would have drooled at that number. The interest is intense. And yet when it came to the general election debates, not one question was asked about climate change, let alone the standoff at Standing Rock. Climate change, the fate of the planet. I think people deeply care. And this has to resonate through the media because it's the way we learn about the world and the rest of the world learns about us.
I mean, yeah.
Thank you, Amy.
I mean, look, there should have been a question. There absolutely should have been a question about climate change, and there just should have been. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. First of all, I just find it depressing and somewhat scary that somebody who's in the Broadcasters Hall of Fame paints a moral equivalence or an equivalence between MSNBC and Fox.
But what?
I find it depressing and frightening that Mr. Schieffer paints an equivalence between MSNBC and
I'm
Fox.
not painting any equivalence of anything. I'm saying there are people on the left that have one point of view and people on the right.
Well,
I'm proud we have both of them, and I think they add to the dialogue. But
well,
I'm not.
I think
I'm
what
not.
you, I think
I'm
what
not equivocating. I'm
Okay,
not.
well,
saying anything's are equal. We're dealing with a vast landscape out here where we now have thousands of sources in all parts of the political spectrum here. So I have.
Okay,
what
I understood you to say, and I won't argue this because my question really goes back to what Ms. Goodman said earlier. And I think that the point, what I understood the point you were trying to make wasn't to say that the media led us into Vietnam. It wasn't to...
Well, it didn't.
I understand that, and it wasn't to argue Vietnam. I think the point was that there has been a history of the media initially showing that it's quote-unquote patriotism by wrapping itself around the government when the country is at war. And it happened in World War II, it happened in Korea, it happened in Vietnam, for better or for worse, because, I mean, there is something to be said for creating the unity that's necessary for a country to go to war. But I think that the problem is Lyndon Johnson was not Donald Trump. FDR wasn't Donald Trump.
Certainly not.
Harry Truman wasn't Donald Trump. The person we have now, although I don't know how much history he knows, I think he is savvy enough to, yes, there is a question, if you will just, excuse me. The question is, how do we avoid, in a period where we are about to potentially go to war with another nuclear power, and we have a president who, as Ms. Goodman pointed out, is currently under siege as he sees it by the media, and knows—
It's currently what?
Under siege by the media.
Oh, okay.
Feels beset by the media, which is finally doing its job. And he knows that the way to get out from under it is to launch a war. How does the press guard against the reflex to wrap yourself around the government?
I don't see anybody wrapping themselves around this at this point.
And we're not at war at this point. My point is—
Well, when did CBS News wrap itself around Donald Trump? I don't remember that.
I am not— you're missing the point, and I think Ms.
No,
Goodman—
I'm trying to find out what your question is.
My question is that right now, in what Mr. Rosenfeld described as a very perilous time, which I think most people would agree, most people here would agree.
I certainly do.
Right. In this perilous time, when you have a person who clearly sees the world reflected only through his
All right, I'm
own
going to jump in
needs.
just for a second about
Yeah.
the two different types of media, because I think
I don't think you've got a question there, but I appreciate your point of view. Thank you.
I just want to say that, there's been a lot of discussion of what is the media, and there's different types of media, right? Like, as I said, I covered the Republican primary, and you go and you ask voters, who is your most trusted source of straight news? And it's something I asked hundreds of people on the campaign trail. And early in the 2015, the answer was something many of you may not have even heard of. It was called The Blaze. Over and over, people said The Blaze, which is Glenn Beck's network. This is the #1 trusted source of news for many, many people in Iowa. The Blaze is, if journalism, it's advocacy journalism. If journalism at all, he's presenting things from a total slant because he wants a particular outcome, okay? And there's many on the left who have journalism for a particular outcome. And my view as a sort of mainstream reporter who's worked for a series of mainstream news outlets is I want to explain what's happening. I want to tell you something you would otherwise not know unless I found it out and told it to you. And that's my chief prerogative. So on the night that, they launched those missiles, that you read that quote, I'm trying to figure out what the president's mindset was. I'm trying to figure out who he was meeting with, what meetings happened earlier that day, what was his state of mind. All of those things, those are the questions that I'm asking. I'm not thinking about whether this was the right decision or the wrong decision. I'm trying to explain his decision. And so I think that for me personally, that's my highest calling. And so when it comes to why aren't you doing this because I want you to talk about this, then that's your calling. That's what you want. And that's fine. And what I see is my role, explain what's happening and tell you it, because otherwise you're not going to find out.
And that's our job. That's what we do. Here we are. Got ready. I'm told we have time for one more question.
Thank you for a great discussion on the nature of facts and on fake news. But in the process of talking about facts, we also brought up, I think, one of the self-validating myths of the media, the Walter Cronkite moment, the idea that LBJ saw this and then talked afterwards about how he has lost the country or lost Middle America. I know Dr. Brinkley has done a lot of scholarship on this topic, so I'm curious as to whether your best sense of whether Lyndon Johnson ever actually said that.
Yes.
And if so, what actual evidence there is, and if not, kind of how these self-validating myths continue to perpetuate themselves over time.
Bob,
Let me just answer first, because George Christian, who was the president's press secretary, told me that himself in an interview when I wrote the book This Just In. Many people thought that Lyndon Johnson saw this on television. He did not actually see Walter's report, but George Christian saw it and came to the president, showed it to him on videotape, And at that point, George Christian told me, the president said to him, if I've lost Walter, I've lost the American people. Now, that's my reporting, but I'd known George Christian for years, and I knew him in years after he was the press secretary, and he was a person of unquestioned character. But that's my story.
And I agree with that, Bob. And also that it's just a little side note, but it wasn't on the nightly news when Cronkite did that. He did an hour special, Vietnam, who, what, where, when, and why. And he went to Tet Offensive, got his number. He went and became an old-time reporter like he had been during the Battle of the Bulge, took notes, and I think his source was General Abrams, too, that Westmoreland was fudging with facts. And Abrams, Walter had met during World War II, and he knew Abrams too. I'm not positive it was Abrams because he was Walter's source, but I'm not 100%. It was him. But the point is, Cronkite came back and said this thing, we've been being lied to. And you can see how the American public responded to Cronkite, because up until 1968, that Cronkite moment, he wasn't winning that many media awards. You should see the awards he won by the end of '68. The Edward R. Murrow Award, because Cronkite was liked by reporters. And once that people said, Mike Cronkite turned on Lyndon Johnson, it spread through the journalistic ranks a great deal. But to the questioner's point, Johnson would not, that's why Lyndon Johnson didn't run in '68. It's just one straw on the camel's back. Johnson's heart condition was terrible. Johnson was unnerved by Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. Johnson thought he couldn't execute the war if he had to go campaign. So it was a culmination of reasons. But Walter's moment, I think, is factual and important.
All right. Well, I think on that, I'm sorry to say, I think we have to. One more?
Written and concise. I promise.
All right.
Real quick. As a pastor and president of the New York State Council of Churches, more and more faith communities are working to articulate morality in contrast to an immoral presidency. Yet the press still tends to amplify faith leaders co-opted by the president and the far right. My question is, why is this, and how can the progressive faith community reframe its articulation of moral truth to be better heard by the press and the wider community?
Ladies and gentlemen.
I need to take two questions and
A 30-second answer to that, having covered Republican politics and focused on religious leaders on the right, the religious right's political power is far more concentrated and greater than the religious left's political power, especially when it comes to presidential politics, because the race begins in Iowa, because evangelical conservatives in Iowa are such a critical bloc. They get an outsized say for all of those particular reasons. Now, I can't speak to over the rest of the political calendar, but I can say every campaign on the Republican side who wants to run for president, one of the first things they think about is winning over evangelical conservatives in Iowa. And that's an incredible political power, of which there is not an equivalent on the left.
All right. All right, here.
Excuse me, I just want to know if, since the U.S. is one of the only countries that allows lobbying.
I'm sorry, I just don't understand you.
Hello?
There you go.
Since the U.S. is one of the only countries that allows lobbying, do you think politics could get any better when profit is also mixed in with government? Because when a senator or something is getting paid to advocate a certain way of thinking, or a certain company or organization, their way of, or legislation that can help them, how do you think politics can get any better when profit is mixed in with the government?
So are you saying we shouldn't have lobbyists? Is that what you're...
I think we should not have lobbyists.
Yeah, well, I'll let others speak to this as well, but I mean, I think the people have a right to petition the government. I think that's part of the Constitution. So I think people have a right to try to make their views known to their members of Congress. But let me also say, our system has become so overwhelmed by money that's one of the things that's wrong with our politics now. We have made running for office so odious. We have made it such an unpleasant thing because there's so much emphasis on just raising money and raising money and raising money that our best and brightest are simply not getting, they're turning away from politics and public service rather than turning toward it. When I was a little boy, my grandma thought I was going to grow up to be President of the United States of America. You know why she thought that? Because that's what every grandmother thought about her grandson. Now, I asked you this question. How long has it been since you've met anybody who says, boy, I sure hope my kid grows up to be a politician? That's what's wrong. That's what this thing we've been going through has done to our politics. We have got to get our best and brightest people focused back on public service and understanding that they really can make a difference. My generation has blown it. It's up to these kids sitting up here. They're the ones that are the great hope for this country.
Thank you.
So I think on that, we'll let her go. Thank you all. You're a great audience.
1 minute. The books will be for sale in the lobby. Be back here early, wake up at 9:30, and come here early for dirty deeds, election mischief, cybercrimes, and civil liberties. Please thank our panel, Douglas Brinkley, Amy Goodman, Harry Rosenfeld, Shayne Goldmacher, and Bob Schieffer. Thank you all.